Welcome to the Hôtel Lausanne, a beautiful historic townhouse on the Ile St Louis in the center of Paris. These decorated rooms look out on the Seine River from the first and second story. Outside, we see the Seine floating by, we see the historical buildings across the water. What better place would there be to talk about water values? So, what do I mean with water values? I'm talking about the ways in which water is embedded in our form, function, in our institutions. So historically, we've always lived with water. People need water for individual survival, for community building. The ways we do this can entail drinking water, sewage water, water management, flood defense. So there are many ways of living with water. Now, the way we live with water depends on the value that we give to it. Now, values may be a broad term. How do we understand this? Well, if we are looking at water to swim in, we want the water to be clean. We want to be able to access it. If we want water just as a place to dispose our sewage of, we might just as well build some high walls to protect ourselves from it. So these different values are really embedded in the site that we are currently on. The Ile St Louis is a hub for understanding those different types of water values. Now, one more thing before we go outside and actually look at these different faces of the Seine, the different cardinal points. Values are embedded in the way in which humans engage with the nature. Depending on how we look at the water, we will design it differently. So in that sense, values are situational. They're dependent on the situation, on the place where we are actually located. They come together as individual, as community choices, and depending on that, they will be hierarchical. So group of peoples may decide that this is how we want to deal with a certain type of values of water in this case. As such, they are also political. The more people decide that this is the way how to deal with water, the more potential there is for actually applying it. So with that notion of values being also political, they are at the same time dynamic. Politics change, our approach to economics, to technology changes, and we have a layered landscape of different values over time. The ways in which the Seine was built in the beginning may no longer be the way in which we live with the Seine today. So this dynamics of values leads to another question. It leads to the question of how do we deal with the history and the heritage of the choices of the past. We may say, well, the choices we made in the past were not the right ones. Let's demolish what has been there, or let's alter the context in which it was built. One example for this could be to say the highways that were built alongside the Seine in the 1960s. Today, the quays have been returned to pedestrian use. But the other thing is, how do we use this heritage potentially as an enabler to change the discourses around water, and what do we want to preserve? So let's take a look at the Ile St Louis and take a look on how these different values have been layered over time since the construction of this island in the 17th century with all these beautiful villas, to the moment that the city of Paris has now decided to take the opposite side of the river as one of the 3 locations for a swimming pool in the Seine. From the beautiful rooms of the Hôtel Lausanne, you see a constantly changing river Seine with different colors, different seasons. You see boats passing by, bringing tourists and goods up and down the river. You see the quays on the opposing side with the lower ones that may be flooded and the higher ones that are meant to protect the city itself. We have some remnants of historic port practices on the other side of the river where today coffee shops and so on are located. We are now on the Quai d'Anjou, just across from one of the former port buildings on the Quai des Célestins. This was an area where actual port activities took place. In Paris, between each of the bridges, we call this a port. Historically, at that site, people may have been washing horses. Now, this is one of the places that will be redeveloped in a swimming pool in 2025. You already see the construction going on there. It's also the place where the mayor of Paris, Madame Hidalgo, went into the water to swim. But what does it mean if we want to swim in a river? Well, look at the height of these quays. You have to find ways of getting in and out. You have to find places to dry off or to, well, maybe warm up and sit in the coffee shop that is just next to it. So changing the way we use the river changes our values on that river. It also means that if we want to be able to swim here, the river has to be cleaned up. We can't have sewage. And that was one of the key discussions in the run-up to the Olympics in Paris to how to solve this. So as the Parisians engage in new leisurely activities, a process that has started since Paris Plage about 20 years ago, new discussions come to the front. How are we going to deal with questions of biodiversity? Should the river have a legal persona? How will other new activities, leisurely practices, kayaking, canoeing, supping, things that are happening on rivers elsewhere in the world, how will this be accommodated in Paris and facilitated? Looking east from the Square Barry towards the Ministry of Finance, the Grande Bibliothèque and the Jardin des Plantes allows us to speak about the source of the river. The Seine comes down from the east. It used to serve for drinking water and for washing, but meaning that this river had to be very clean. Sewage interferes with this possibility of drinking the water or today swimming. Other tributaries of the River Seine were completely covered up. The Bièvre, which lands in the Seine sometime closer to here, are covered. They are no longer visible, and only a few attempts have been made to bring it up to the surface again. But that is very difficult given that so many houses and structures have been built on top of these former rivers. In order to keep the water in Paris clean, we need to have green agriculture upstream. We need to make sure that other pollution doesn't travel downstream, and it is then only fair if that same rule applies for Paris and the areas downstream where that pollution will later travel to. As we change our views of the river, as we engage in swimming practices, as we think more comprehensively about biodiversity, we need to address the question of pollution. And that was one of the major challenges for the Olympics, where major infrastructures were built to make sure that there is less pollution coming down the river, but also that waters that are being swept away from rain into the canal system are not flooding over into the river itself. So for the future, this raises many questions about circularity. How will we deal with wastewater, with sewage water, to make sure that the natural processes are not disturbed and that humans can benefit from the river in its entire length? Looking south from the Ile St Louis towards the Institut du Monde Arabe and the Latin Quarter over there, we're across from the former Roman city. The river has always had a wide bed where it could expend whatever things were flooding. But over the centuries, high walls have been built to contain the river. As we can see it behind here, there's a drop of some 10 meters down. And yet, all of these constructions are not enough, or were not enough, when the river flooded in 1910. What happened at that time is that the river was maybe 8–10 meters up from here, places were flooded here, but most of the flooding occurred because the water was pressing upward out of the sewage channels. So the construction that Haussmann and Beltran had provided allowed the water to come back up. Now, in a time of climate change where water systems are changing, how are we going to deal with these kinds of challenges in the future? Keep in mind that once the water rises, even the boats can no longer pass under the bridges. At the time, people had cesspits in their own yards. All of this was polluting. Now, we have to deal with the former quay walls and the bridges. They are part of our history and our heritage. But it raises a big question: if flooding happens again, how will it affect the musea, which might have storage in their basements? How are we going to deal with the heritage that we really want to preserve, and at the same time make sure that safety measures are undertaken? And it may not only be flooding, it may just as well be drought. If you go to the musea and you look at old paintings, you will see that the Seine was empty in the summer months. Well, just imagine if there were no boats that could pass by the Seine at a given moment in time. The response to the flood of 1910 was to build retention basins all the way up, further up of the river, so that the water could be equally distributed. In that sense, the Seine is not a natural river anymore. It is very much a calculated flow of water that serves shipping and that makes sure that we are protected. But we have to rethink the history and the heritage of these sites at a time when water is changing and water systems are transforming. From Place Louis Aragon on the Ile St Louis, we are now looking west. This is a good place to talk about shipping. In fact, shipping has been a key factor of the rise of Paris throughout the ages. Fluctuat nec mergitur, she's tossed by the waves and never sinks, is the motto of the city. You'll find it on chairs inside the Mairie de Paris, inside the town hall. You will find it all throughout the city. And yet this notion of Paris as a port city has somewhat disappeared. You have to look very carefully to see how big ships with goods are actually crossing the city, either bringing grains or building materials or other bulks from the source into the river all the way to Rouen and the port of Le Havre. Or the other way around, goods arrive from the ocean, coming into the city and being distributed here. There's quite a number of really new initiatives in Paris around the shipping dimension. The port of Javel-Bas, which is over there at the western side of the center of Paris, still in the historic district, has recently won the Antoine Ruffenac Prize as being a model for multifunctional use of port spaces within a historic city. There, shipping takes place, and when the ship arrives, the gates may be retracted. For the rest of the time, it remains a public space along the quays where people can enjoy the water. Similarly, the construction next to it has been risen up so that in case of flooding, the buildings are being safe. Similar building challenges exist alongside the Seine, for example, in the area of Bercy, where we have old concrete factories where new functions of shipping goods, shipping tourists, and swimming will and actually are already coinciding. So those new values of water, those new functions need to be aligned and brought into a single spatial condition. Now, this raises the question, how can we then accommodate functions that we need, such as shipping, but also respect the desire to have a clean river where you could actually be swimming in, and allow for all these functions to happen simultaneously while making sure that this is a river that also has a lot of biodiversity and allows fish to come back. Maybe we can even think of the reasons and the places where the ideas and needs of fish are aligned with those of shipping on the Seine River. Shipping is a key function of Paris even today, although we don't see it as much. IKEA, for example, has opted to ship at night using smaller, lighter aluminum containers, and the goods are then being carried to the customers via electric vehicles into the city. Franprix is similar, using other times of the day to reach their customers and distribute their goods. That kind of use of the river for a more sustainable, circular way of logistics is very important. And it really raises the question, how are we going to deal with last mile logistics in inner cities in the future? And what role can shipping and the use of rivers actually play in that? We have now come back to the Institute of Advanced Studies in the Hôtel Lausanne after having taken a tour of the Ile St Louis, and we've looked at 4 different water values. Swimming on the north, looking towards the source in the east and talking about sewage, discussing the south part of the island through the lens of safety, and finally looking towards the Hôtel de Ville and discussing the question of shipping. Now, there's many more values that we could attribute to water and that we can discuss. There are both tangible ones, think of energy, or for example, but there are also intangible ones, which are questions about governance, about cultures. How many songs do you have on the different types of water in a city? How can we bring people back to celebrating water, to knowing water? How can we build water mindsets? And I believe that we do need this value-based approach towards water to design with and for water in a holistic way, taking into account existing ecosystems, thinking about water as part of a watershed. So balancing the interests of swimming, shipping, sewage, safety, and all the others that there are, developing appropriate governance frameworks, methodologies that allow us to bring in a broader public, not just professionals of water, but everyday citizens, and developing a vision and a mission for an ecosystemic, holistic approach to the future. That is what is needed today. Now, we see inside Paris a new entente, a new collaboration along the Seine axis from Paris via Rouen to Le Havre. If we want to reindustrialize, for example, this axis, we will need buy-in from all the stakeholders along the axis. We will have to carefully understand what the impact of the different spaces and institutions is in their territory. We have to avoid that there are social injustices being created through these kinds of new developments. We can have seen through time that Paris may depend on shipping from Le Havre, but still there needs to be also good life quality in Le Havre or in Rouen, or at the same way upstream. So in order to develop holistic ecosystemic approaches to spatial development, to governance, we need a value-based approach that integrates these different layers of water. How can we do this? So one of the things that are important, in my opinion, is to use methodologies that are including the long durée, the long-term development, that are bringing together stakeholders, knowledge holders of different layers and levels, not just governance agencies, and not just a kind of participation through confirmation, but really inclusive development, and to take into account the role of culture. As we said in the beginning, we may today have a culture of focusing on economic values. But what if other values took the lead? If it's about not speed, but about slowness? If we are thinking about ecosystemic development, including other living beings, not just humans. So to develop these kinds of novel practices, we need strategies and a methodology and tools to really take everybody along. Among these tools are value-based methodologies, but they can also be scientific ones. Think, for example, about sensors. Imagine we could have inside the Seine a variety of sensors, including ones that involve citizen science, to measure water quality, water speed, the amount of plastic particles in the water, the distribution of ships in different seasons at different parts of the day, and activities that will bring in these kinds of scientific measurements into the common debate. You could imagine artistic projects, you could imagine children engagement through drones or having little boats on the river to bring back this knowledge about water. Such a knowledge of water has already been built in Paris since Paris Plage, but there are definitely more steps to take at the multiple scales, so including the axe of the Seine beyond Paris and the Île-de-France, and to bring in young generations who will be the decision makers of the future and who will have to take a city basin approach, as OECD is phrasing it, and who will have to take into account the existing structures, the heritage that makes Paris what Paris is. So it is not about just imagining a future that is the same everywhere, but it's about building upon the beauty, the functions, the forms of the past to develop a more circular and inclusive future. And this is what we've seen through the lens of shipping, making shipping circular, less polluting. This is what we've seen through the lens of safety, thinking not just about floods, but various ways of making living with water safer. And this might in the future even involve floating structures in the Seine. The Olympics made a very good example of that. But it's also about dealing with the question of sewage, and sewage understood largely including plastic pollution. Let's not forget that much of the pollution of the oceans is actually coming from the rivers. And finally, as the piece of change that is perhaps most important, swimming, a return of the person, the body, into the water, which means that water has to be almost drinkable, good enough for people not to get sick. And that approach of creating new narratives, new values around this bodily engagement of people with the water also allows us to rethink the ecosystems in which we live in, because it may also be that swimming is not good for the river. For example, the case of the Loire, where we also, they have a parliament of the Loire established, having all of the sunscreen in the water may be actually detrimental to the river itself. So what are the good engagements with water, like the water of the Seine here in Paris and the Île-de-France? And how can we live collaboratively with water in a way that we will actually have improved water after it has traveled through a city, rather than having polluted waters? This is thus a call for a holistic, ecosystemic, value-based engagement with water through all of its dimensions. And Paris is a great model to look at.